What's up everyone, welcome back here at the Neon Pavilion. My name is Niklas and it has been a while, but I'm back now and today we are talking about a Eurovision event that I feel like a lot of people aren't talking about. This isn't something that usually gets covered in the Eurovision fan media on the YouTubes and everything, but I feel like it's something that some might actually be interested in learning more about. So today we are talking about the Eurovision Young Musicians. Of course we're doing that because this weekend, more specifically on the 17th of August, the 21st Eurovision Young Musicians will be taking place in Bodø in Norway. Despite it being a contest that I don't see a lot of Eurovision fans talking about, it is a contest that has a long history and is still going strong today. So let's talk a little bit about it today. Now, while the Eurovision Song Contest is often just shortened down to Eurovision, that isn't exactly the right thing to do. I mean, keep on doing it. We're all gonna do it. I'm still gonna do it in my videos and all of that, right? But the name Eurovision itself is actually the name of the network that the EBU is the owner of. I feel like most people probably know this already, but the Eurovision network is the network and the collaborations between the European broadcasters. And it is the network responsible for broadcasting Eurovision and for sending out the signal of the Eurovision Song Contest to all of the countries taking part, and of course everyone else and all that. But the Eurovision network is not only responsible for the song contest, of course, they're also responsible for the news broadcasts, a lot of sports broadcasts around Europe, and also some other Eurovision family of events, as they like to call it, some other of these, not necessarily song contests, but other kinds of contests and events. You probably know the Junior Eurovision Song Contest. I feel like most Eurovision fans does, and we cover that on this channel as well. But there's also something like the Vienna New Year's concert, which you may not know is a Eurovision production. It is, and I do think that a lot of Europeans are watching that every single year. But there's also some lesser known programs that doesn't exist anymore. Like, do you remember the Eurovision Dance Contest or a program like Jeux Sans Frontières? We'll get back to that in another video, by the way. But another one of these Eurovision events, that is indeed the Eurovision Young Musicians, with a history dating all the way back to the 1980s. To put it simply, Eurovision Young Musicians is a classical music competition where young classical music talents are able to showcase what they're made of on an international stage. Actually, the idea goes all the way back to the 1970s. Back in 1978, the BBC in the UK broadcast the first edition of the BBC Young Musicians, which was a way for the broadcaster to showcase young musical talent, and that is indeed a contest that is still going on today. Going into the 1980s, that is when a lot of other countries were starting to do a similar little contest inspired by the BBC, but they weren't the only ones being inspired. The EBU was as well. So in 1980, an expert group at the EBU started looking at this BBC format and looking at if it was possible to make a Eurovision version of this. I read somewhere that compared to the Eurovision Song Contest, this show, at least in the eyes of the EBU back then, felt like a program that was easier to produce. And that may sound weird today, but looking back at it and looking at what sorts of programs were on television back in the early days, that was a lot of theater and musical concerts being transmitted. And the Eurovision Young Musicians and the setup for that program is a lot more like broadcasting a concert. So from that perspective, I do think it makes sense. BBC Young Musician proved to be a success, so the EBU went ahead with the idea, and in 1982 in Manchester, the first Eurovision Young Musicians was held. Now I'm gonna try to keep the history lessons of this video pretty brief. The reason for that is mainly that there just isn't a lot of information about these earlier contests. In fact, you can't really find much of the Eurovision Young Musicians from back in the days. The shows are largely considered lost media, at least here on the internet. I don't know if the EBU has copies of all the old shows, but I don't think there's much interest in really finding them and putting them out there on the internet, so they may be out there somewhere somewhere, but you can't find a lot of neither information or clips or pictures from these earlier contests. But 6 countries did take part in the first edition back in 1982, those being United Kingdom, France, Norway, Switzerland, Austria, and West Germany. Now actually, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland wanted to participate, but they ended up sending a joint participant, this time being from Norway. They did that for the first 2 years. The reason simply being that having 9 participants, which it would have been, it would be too long. At least that's what I can find when I researched this, and also what it says on Wikipedia, was that it would exceed the maximum broadcast time that you were able to broadcast such a live television event back in the days. We gotta remember, this is back in the 80s, and this probably wasn't funded in the same way that the Eurovision Song Contest was, given that it was a smaller contest, so that might be the reason for it. Now, just like the BBC Young Musicians, the contest is held every other year, so on the 3rd edition in 1986, the contest was growing and a lot more countries wanted to take part than they were able to fit in that aforementioned time slot that I talked about before. So the idea was to introduce a preliminary round, a kind of a semi-final, but it wasn't something that was broadcasted anywhere. So yes, Eurovision Young Musicians did have semi-finals long before the Eurovision did. But this preliminary round is interesting for 2 reasons. The first, of course, being that this wasn't being broadcasted anywhere. It wasn't being broadcast on TV, and it wasn't being broadcasted on the radio either. In 1986, it was Denmark hosting the contest in Copenhagen, but again, unlike the Eurovision Song Contest, where the host country gets a free pass into the final, at least that's how it's been ever since semifinals were introduced to the Eurovision Song Contest. They didn't have that kind of system in place back in 1986 for Eurovision Young Musicians, and actually it ended up with Denmark not qualifying for the final. So Denmark may have been hosting in 1986, but they weren't on the final list of participants on the television show. I believe the same thing happened when the Netherlands was hosting 2 years later as well. It's an interesting way of doing it, but that's the way they chose to do it back in the days. It seems like the popularity of this contest has gone up and down a bit ever since it began. The current record for participating countries, that is 24, a record that was set both in 1994 and again in 2000. But if we look 2 years back to 2022 and the most recent Eurovision Young Musicians in Montpellier in France, we only had 9 participating countries. But I'd say that the contest is still like steadily around those like 10 to 15 participants. So I think that's okay. Of course it could be more, but a lot of these contests have always struggled with participants. If you just look at something like the Junior Eurovision Song Contest, that's also been the same story for many years. Germany and Austria are the 2 countries that have participated the most amount of times in this contest, at least if you count Germany and West Germany as one country. Austria is also the country that has won it the most times. They've done so 5 times, and actually, despite there not being a rule in place for the winner to host the next country, Austria is also the country that has hosted the most times. They've done so 6 times, with 4 of them being in a row. In fact, the contest was part of the Vienna Music Festival for a fair few years, being the opening contest of that festival. And it does make a lot of sense when you already have the stage and you already have the talents there. Why not make it part of it? Now, before we go back to present day, here is a few fun facts about the young musicians. In case you're wondering, the most successful instrument in the Eurovision Young Musicians, that's the violin. It's been a total of 9 times so far that a violinist has won the contest. The contest sadly holds the record for being the Eurovision event that's gone on for more than 2 years to have the most amount of participants that's only participated once. Around 40 countries have taken part over the 21 contests so far, but a lot of them have only participated once. However, a lot of the countries behind the former Iron Curtain actually made their Eurovision network debut in this contest. Czech Republic, Hungary, Latvia, North Macedonia, and Poland have all made their debuts into a Eurovision event in Eurovision Young Musicians. And finally, Eurovision Young Musicians is also the only contest so far to have been held outdoors. In fact, on a few different occasions, this contest has been held in an outdoor space. This is contrary to something like the Eurovision Song Contest, where it very clearly states in the rules that you aren't allowed to have the contest going on outside. It may be due to like safety, security, but it may also be due to the fact that European weather in May can go very different ways. In case you've never watched the Eurovision Young Musicians before, here's a little rundown of the format. Each country taking part is represented by one young musician performing a classical music piece of their choice. This also means that unlike the Eurovision Song Contest, we have no original compositions in this competition. And that was a very difficult sentence to say. The age range of the participants has fluctuated a bit in between the different contests. I couldn't figure out who has been the youngest and the oldest participants, so we'll save that for another day. But right now, as the current rules say, you have to be between 12 and 21 to take part. So they aren't necessarily all kids. This isn't a junior Eurovision, but for classical music. Also, as far as I'm aware at least, any instrument can be played on the stage in the contest. I couldn't find anything that said specifically which instruments were allowed to take part, so let me know if that is. But over the course of the years that this contest has gone on, we've seen a lot of different instruments and also some more niche instruments, so I don't think there is a rule. Of course, for those missing the element of live music in Eurovision Song Contest, this contest might be for you. Not only do we have the performer, of course, performing their instrument live, but they're also accompanied by a national orchestra of the host broadcaster. There's no televoting in this contest, and there never has been. The winner is decided based on a jury of classical music professionals. This year there are 11 people forming this singular jury deciding the winner, with one of the jurors this year being a former participant of the Eurovision Young Musicians. That being Martin Grobiner from Austria. Like I said, the amount of participants have fluctuated over the years, but this year we've landed on 11 participants. 2 countries are returning to the contest this year, those being Armenia and Switzerland. And the remaining participants in this year's contest are as follows: Austria, Belgium, Czechia, France, Germany, Poland, Serbia, Sweden, and of course, host country Norway. And like I already mentioned in the beginning, this year's show is hosted in Bodø in Norway, one of 3 European capitals of culture in 2024. The Stormen Concert Hall will be the venue where the final will take place, and this is the second time that Norway is hosting the contest. The first time they did so, that was back in 2000 in Bern. So the big question, of course, now that you know a little bit more about the contest, is should you be watching? Of course, it is a little bit more of a niche contest compared to the big Eurovision or even something like the Junior Eurovision. I don't think there are as many people tuning into this contest, and I also don't think a lot of the commoners, or whatever you want to call them, are tuning in. As someone who has watched a little bit of Eurovision Young Musicians before, I do think you have to have at least a little bit of an understanding of classical music to really truly appreciate this show. And if you aren't a fan of classical music at all, this probably isn't the show for you, but that's okay. The show isn't all glitz and glamour like the Eurovision Song Contest, and it isn't meant to be. This is a contest that in its core is made to showcase raw young musical talent. And frankly, we don't have a lot of these kinds of things on television anymore. A lot of the competitions we see, such as X Factor and such as other of these shows, are heavily influenced by producers wanting to make the show feel a certain way. Shows like like X Factor and The Voice have been criticized because of their use of autotune, and we've even seen in the Eurovision Song Contest that a lot of people did not like when the backing track on tape was introduced to the contest. The Eurovision Young Musicians is none of that. It is classical music. It's being performed live with a real orchestra also performing live. And I do think it's nice that despite public service television going more and more after the commercial broadcasters and doing more and more commercial stuff, it is nice to see that a contest like Eurovision Young Musicians can still go on, even though it feels a little dated, even though it feels a little slow compared to some of the other things being broadcasted. And if you are a young person who are interested in classical music, who plays an instrument and want to get yourself out there on an international stage, this is one of the few places where you can really do it, and you can get onto the TV screens of Europeans all over Europe and even some people outside of Europe. It is definitely the place to go. While there are many smaller competitions and even bigger competition than this, I feel like in the space, a lot of them aren't televised, and at least not televised to the extent that this is. So while it may not be as popular anymore as it maybe once were, I do still think that it is a platform for young people to really showcase their talent. And you can see when you go look at some of the earlier winners, they have made a career after this. They have really gone out there and become musicians that people in the classical music sphere know about. 11 participating countries may not sound like a lot, and it isn't, but I do still think it's alright for a contest like this. And despite everything, Eurovision Young Musicians together with the Junior Eurovision are, at the moment at least, the only two Eurovision spin-off to still be surviving. I do think this contest has its place. I think it's nice that it's still going on, and I'm no classical music expert, so I don't think I get the full out of this show. I don't think I get its full potential, but I do still find it interesting to watch. Maybe not as the primary thing that I really sit down and engage with in the same kind of way that I do for the Eurovision Song Contest, but I do think it's good second screen contest to have in the background and to listen and appreciate the classical music, which for many of us, I feel like it's something we don't hear very often. So that was my thoughts, a little bit of history and a little bit of knowledge about the Eurovision Young Musicians. I do want to make more videos talking about these lesser known Eurovision events. I have a few ideas in the pipeline, so they will hopefully come out soon after this one. Thank you for watching nonetheless. I hope you enjoyed, and I do hope you learned something new. Leave a like if you enjoyed, subscribe for more Neon Pavilion content, and I'll hopefully see you guys for the next video. Take care.